I suppose the most important starting point for me is that I feel that we are just not sufficiently joined up in the way that we think about these issues. So, and it doesn't matter what sector you're in, and that it is impossible, in my view, to actually tackle any issues around equality and diversity if we're not really clear about the kind of country that we're living in, the kind of national context that we're having to address, and the way in which those issues are reflected through that lens. And because, as Britain, we think we're pretty good at this stuff, I actually feel that we are incredibly complacent. That some of that actually is about class, which we hardly ever talk about. We do have this incredible sense of privilege that some in our society have, and we never talk about how that has actually, as it were, infected our national character and the way we think about certain issues. But also the way that we think about women is also through a lens of how our society overall thinks about women. When I first arrived, so I've been at SOAS now just over a year, and just before I started, I attended the National UUK conference. I think that's where we first met. And I arrived sort of halfway through the first day, and there'd been a lot of fuss around my appointment because I was the first black woman. And I have to say, I did a number of interviews at that point where I said I was absolutely staggered, and I was, because I'd been out of the UK for 6 years. I hadn't really thought about it. I'd seen this job, it looked like a great job, I applied for it. I hadn't been thinking about Britain for a very long time, and specifically not thinking about the education, the higher education sector. So I was told I was the first black woman, but of course I knew that there were quite a lot of women VCs, and so I walked into this conference hall. It was in Surrey, I think, where our conference was. And I came in at the back, and I was sort of really taken aback that there were just so many men in the room, which is not to say that there aren't a lot of women and there aren't a lot of women coming through, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but it just wasn't really visible. And I'd come from the United Nations, where I'd worked in a very, very diverse environment geographically, but where I'd also worked with a UN Secretary General who had been determined to make sure that 50% of his senior team were women, and he had been pretty successful at doing that. Although I have to say that as some of us left, we weren't necessarily replaced by other women, so it changed over time, but that's another challenge. So I was really struck by that. And then I saw there was another black woman in the room, so I was really pleased, and she was right down at the front, and I thought, nobody told me about her. Nobody told me about this other woman. And when whoever was speaking stopped speaking, she got up and she had the mic in her hand, because she was going to take it round. Cannot tell you the sort of huge sense of disappointment that I felt. So, of course, visually, that told me something about our sector and the challenges that we face. But also, SOAS is a very particular kind of place. We're a highly diverse university. About 44% of our students are international students. About 15% of our students come from other EU countries. So the total comes to nearer 60%. And on any day in SOAS, you just see people from all over the world talking, a whole range of languages. And the makeup of our faculty is also extremely diverse. In fact, our staff across faculty and professional services. We are about to be, I think, one of very few universities where the director, the president, Gracia Michel is our president, but also our board of trustees. We have a new chair of board of trustees starting in November, is also a woman. So we're going to have 3 women at the top of SOAS, and we're very, very proud of that. But we are really not complacent, and that's partly because we have very few professors, black women professors, very, very few. As a university, we continue to have a gap between the number of women professors and male professors, not quite as bad as the national average, but it is a challenge for us. and how we actually make sure that the diversity that we're so proud of is understood by others and seen as a strength is something that we really have to work on. So that's the sort of contextual bit. And when I woke up, well, actually not woke up because I watched the results. I'm a bit of a political junkie. So having said to myself I was not going to watch the referendum results all the way through the night and that I was going to go to bed and wake up at about 5 o'clock, I watched them all through the night. And rather interestingly, was not surprised at the result, and in fact had been at a dinner with some other vice-chancellors that evening when they were all saying it's going to be okay, and I said I don't think it's going to be okay. And I was partly saying that because although I'd been out of Britain for 6 years, I had campaigned, on behalf of the Labour Party, as it happens, that's the party I'm a member of, in the elections in 2001 and 2005, and I had seen a huge amount of dissatisfaction around the country about the direction of the country, where we were going, lack of investment in basic services like education, health, housing, but crucially people feeling a real deep sense that there was, and it wasn't even a south versus the north, more of a sort of London versus the rest of the country, but also people feeling really profoundly that globalization wasn't for them, that what it was ending up with was that jobs were being taken out of their communities, that their children couldn't stay in their local areas. And that word alienation is seen as very old-fashioned, but really a profound and deep sense of alienation. So I wasn't surprised, but what I was surprised at was how depressed I became and how personally, for the very first time, I'm a first-generation migrant. I came to this country when I was 9 years old. I've been through all sorts of stuff. The first black girl in the grammar school that I went to, people having never seen a black person before and being very curious about that, through some really sort of horrible things, being spat at in the street. When my parents tried to buy their first house, a petition, somebody tried to get a petition going to make sure they didn't. Lots of people didn't sign it, so it didn't happen. When I was at university, being subjected not on campus but in a nearby small town to actual, violence and having to run away to make sure I wasn't being beaten up. I'd been through all that. I'd been through, the years of Enoch Powell, Rivers of Blood, all of that. It was the very first time that I felt that this was not my country. It was amazing to me. It was not something that I expected. And then I felt completely dislocated because I thought, well, where am I supposed to go? Where is supposed to be home? And a lot of people felt like that. And a lot of people felt like that not because they were migrants, but just because of, I think, the way that campaign was conducted. And it's not about people feeling a sense of unease at the way that their communities had changed. I think that is absolutely right, that people can feel that. I think it's absolutely right that we should have a debate about that. I think it's wrong to pretend that we're all comfortable with change. When we think, none of us is really comfortable with change. We have to think about it, manage it, even when we really want it, it can have a really difficult and profound impact on us, and it has unintended consequences. It's not that I think we shouldn't have that debate, and it's not that I felt that in the referendum campaign we shouldn't have that debate, but it was the way that the focus around immigration, migration and refugees, the rhetorical nature of some of the discourse, and the way that it legitimized a certain way of talking about race, it actually sort of opened the door to something extraordinary in a country which has had, generations of migrants and has felt very open and tolerant, even though we've had a huge number of challenges that we had to deal with. And as a result, we've seen a rise in hate crime, harassment, fear. My students talking about what they're having to face on the way to SOAS. Not actually on campus itself, corroding the things that have been so special about who we are and what we're about. But I also know, and that's why I haven't remained depressed, that this is not the way that every Briton feels. How could they? And that not everybody is giving voice to everything that they feel. And this morning, those of you who come to London on a regular basis will know about the legend of the London taxi driver, who in the run-up to Brexit, 9 out of 10 taxi drivers, you would get into their taxi and they would then basically harangue you about the importance of Britain leaving the European Union, regardless of who you were and where you came from. And you'd quite often get to the point of thinking, do they actually understand about customers, and looking at who's in the back of the cab? So this morning I get a taxi, not a black cab, and the woman who's driving me was born in Stoke-on-Trent, and she said to me, where are you going? Are you going anywhere nice? I said, I'm going to Bath, and unfortunately I'm not going for long enough to really enjoy Bath. She said, what are you going to be doing there? So I said, I'm going to talk about these issues around equality and diversity. And then all the way to the station we had this fantastic conversation where, that's how I learned about the fact she'd been brought up in Stoke-on-Trent, that she was now in London. She absolutely loved London and London's diversity, and she had felt so uncomfortable with the Brexit stuff and the way that the debate had developed. And she talked about growing up in Stoke-on-Trent 50 years ago, and she said the school that I went to had people from, it was quite diverse, and she said, I really saw it as a privilege as a child to be able to, engage with all these people. And she said, I don't understand how Stoke-on-Trent, which overwhelmingly voted to leave, she said, I don't understand how Stoke-on-Trent 50 years ago has become what Stoke-on-Trent is today. That was really, really interesting, but also really heartwarming for me, because her approach was that we should recognise that we feel uncomfortable about things, but we should do something about it, and we should talk about it. And that's where I think the values come in. One of the things that I think is absolutely crucial and key to all of this is the nature of the leadership that we apply to the management of issues of diversity and equality, and the quality of the leadership and the values that we bring to the table in doing that. And increasingly, when you look at organisations and the way that they are led and managed, what you see is that the values of the organisation and the values of the individuals in them, and the way that you're able to bring those two things together, makes a huge difference in terms of whether or not you can make a step change. The higher education sector, I think, is a sector that's full of passion and values. Our students are full of passion. They have, certainly at SOAS, they have views about absolutely everything. Quite rightly, in my view, because if you can't be an idealist, if you can't think that our world can be very, very different, if you can't think that the adults have got it all wrong, then when can you think like that? Academic institutions are difficult to manage anyway, because, of course, the issues around academic freedom, the importance of debate and discussion, the fact that they can be places which are highly individualized. But there is something that we can harness, which is that passion, that belief, that values base. It doesn't make the leadership any easier. It makes it much, much harder. But when you do it right, I think that the outcome can be very different. So what are the kinds of things that I think do make a difference? And I've been thinking a lot recently about whether having women in leadership positions can be one of the things that makes a big difference. And I've been thinking about it particularly in a global context, because some of you that are interested in international relations will have seen that there was a big debate about whether the recent appointment of the new UN Secretary General, that it was time to have a woman. What I thought was interesting about that debate was that when you really drilled down, you saw that there were a couple of countries actually that were saying it's important to have a women. There are a lot of people from civil society, there are a lot of staff from within the UN, but actually the bulk of the member states of the United Nations, which are run by men, actually weren't necessarily coming out and saying that. And Antonio Guterres, who's been appointed, he's an absolutely outstanding candidate. I've worked with him. But what's interesting to me about that process was that there were some really good women who never ever featured in the top three. The women were always bunched up. When it all started, there were about 12 or 13 candidates. They were always bunched at 6, 7, 8, regardless of who they were, the qualities that they would bring around the table. So you had a process. If you leave aside Antonio, who, I haven't got an issue with him being anything like that, but if you look and who came out as the outstanding candidates throughout the process, but beneath that, you actually had a process that appeared to me to be profoundly flawed, and where that sort of public rhetorical position of, yes, we want to see a woman, wasn't actually reflected in the way that the process went through. Then if you look at what's happening in America, the real possibility that we could have a woman as the first president of the United States, the way that Hillary Clinton is being judged is completely different to the way that Donald Trump is being judged. I mean, there's no two ways about it. It doesn't matter which side of, the political line you sit on. And very often we see that women are judged very differently when they step into senior positions in organizations, what is expected of them. And of course, as women, we judge ourselves very harshly too, because there is that weight that you feel, particularly if you're a first, that you can't let every other woman down by basically failing. Because any kind of risk you take that doesn't quite work out is actually magnified so many times over. I think it's pretty amazing that so many of us have ended up in leadership positions and actually managed to stay there because we are judged through a different lens. Within our own country, we now have our second woman Prime Minister, and I've been thinking about that tricky question as to whether or not women lead differently, and I don't think it's an easy question to answer, because I think it's very, very hard to generalise. It's sometimes very difficult for women to actually prioritise issues of equality and diversity if they're on their own. If they are in a leadership position, but they don't have backup. So it's really important that there's a degree of critical mass, so you actually need others around the leadership table that are supporting you through that. Look at what happened to Angela Merkel last year when she made what was, in my view, the right and the most humane decision around refugees. And then within a very short period of time, because politically it began to go wrong, everybody was jumping on a bandwagon and saying, you've got this wrong. She actually began to be vilified by some, even in her own coalition, around the decision that had been taken. I don't want to claim something for women that is not real. I mean, if you look at France, the leader of the far-right nationalist group in France is Marie Le Pen. But there are many studies which show that the increased presence of women in the boardroom, in the top roles, does lead to improved performance in organisations. There's a recent study by the Peterson Institute of Economics, which looked at 22,000 companies in 91 countries. And they found that 60% of the companies that they looked at had no female board members, just over half had no female senior executives or members of corporate boards, and less than 5% had a female chief executive. And what the study showed was a strong link between the presence of women in corporate leadership positions and what was called positive firm performance. The main elements being the proportion of women executives followed by the proportion of women board members. Interestingly, Just having a woman as the boss, as the CEO, wasn't enough. That in and of itself didn't have a noticeable impact on performance. And that, I think, underscores the importance of creating a sort of pipeline of women managers. But as the point that I made earlier, that it's about critical mass, shared responsibility, being able to get some backup. And again, if you think about Hillary Clinton, who has spent, practically all of her working life championing the issue of women and equality, she's actually had some pretty negative reporting about the fact that she has done that. So let me just say a bit about our own sector. The research carried out by Women Count and published in March this year, in that report they were very clear that women are taking more leadership positions in universities but still remain heavily outnumbered by men in those top jobs. 1 in 3 vice-chancellors hired over the past 2 years, however, has been a woman, which means now that 22% of universities are now led by women, up from 17% in December 2013. So we're making some significant progress. In only 8 cases, however, did universities have both a female VC and a female board chair. So a tiny number. And I've already mentioned how proud I am that SOAS is going to have women in those 3 top roles. But if you dig even deeper into our sector, the Runnymede report, which came out last year, identified that 92% of UK professors are white. 92%. It's 2016. We are a global sector. We are a huge sector contributing to global collaboration and partnerships, academic excellence across the entire world. 92% of UK professors are white. 85 of the UK's 18,000 professors are black. 85. Again, it's 2016. However did that happen? I mean, that's absolutely staggering. And a tiny percentage of those 85 are black women. I think that diversity is absolutely vital for our sector. It's partly because of the nature of what our sector is and what it's about, that it is a huge element of UK PLC, that the international nature of who we are and what we are about leads to and helps to create a more outstanding UK higher education sector. The students in SOAS come from 130 countries. I don't think that every university across the UK is going to be like that, but increasingly the students across UK universities come from a range of countries across the world and contribute to our excellence and helps our focus on partnership and collaboration. The same with our staff. But it's not about the statistics, and I think this is crucial. It's not just about increasing the numbers. It's about what we do with that diversity. So, okay, we improve the numbers. What then happens to you when you're actually in those organisations? Does it help us to think differently, to challenge ourselves, to always engage in critical inquiry, to push the boundaries? As I said, we at SOAS remain concerned that we don't have enough women professors. We definitely don't have enough black women professors. And I think when you look across the world, it's a cause, I think, of enormous concern, not just in the higher education sector, but in other sectors as well, that there's an overwhelming absence of statistical data about women in leadership positions across sectors. And that's because it's not been thought of as important before. Then there are the issues around pay. The Times Higher Education Pay Survey for last year revealed that in our sector, women are paid on average 11.3% less than men in parallel posts. In some institutions, that figure rises to over 20%. For professors, the average disparity is smaller. It's 5.8%, although it rises to 19% in those institutions with the largest gap. Can you imagine what that does within an organisation? Of course, it undermines the confidence of your female staff members. And of course, it's 40 years since we've had equality pay legislation. So It's an absolute embarrassment that that's what our numbers look like. We have the associated challenges around sexual harassment on campus. The NUS survey, for example, revealed that 37% of women and 12% of men had faced unwelcome sexual advances. Equally of concern was that it also found that 60% of respondents said they were unaware of any codes of conduct implemented by their universities or student union that tackle sexual comments, unwelcome sexual advances, and verbal harassment. And there's been a lot in the press recently, following on from the UUK report. This is far too prevalent on our campuses, and it's something that we absolutely are going to have to address. So what can we do about all of this? Obviously, you need a very clear institutional commitment. It needs to be a strategic approach. But I think in putting that strategic approach together, we have to be conscious of context, which is where I started. And the leadership is key. And you have to build a wider organizational self-awareness, which is not necessarily an easy thing to do, because some people will feel that they will somehow end up at the bottom of a queue if you start to reorient the way that your organization is organized. You have to have a strong evidence base, obviously, but as I said before, it's not just about the evidence, it's what do you do with it. We can all collect data, we can analyze it, we can come up with wonderful action plans, but if they sit in a corner and we only look at them once a year and then say, oh, tut, 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 we need to do better, nothing has changed in between. We have to look at what works, what doesn't, all the way through any year, and you have to be prepared to shift gear if necessary. And you have to be aware of the areas where change is really, really stubborn. And every single one of our institutions has those. They're different for each of us, but we all have those. We need to know where we are. We have to think a lot more about what we're going to do about underrepresentation in terms of certain groups of staff. But we also have to think, if you think about the student journey, and for a university like SOAS, we're actually pretty good in terms of our widening participation agenda, but we are terrible in terms of then being able to retain those students. There's far too high an attrition rate, and there is a significant attainment gap which we are going to have to address. So what is it that encourages those students to feel able to come, but then they fall away, particularly between enrolment and the end of year one? We crucially have to look at culture in our organisations. We can't just push culture aside to being somewhere in the back. We must think all the time about unconscious bias. We all have it. Let's not pretend that when we're trying to put our teams together, the default position for all of us is to have more people like us around the table. It's so much easier, because we're reaffirming a view that we already have. But the way that you actually get better and improve and have excellence is actually when you have people around the table that aren't the same. Yeah. When you have that challenge, because it gets you to a different point, because you are seeing issues from a different perspective. So we have to acknowledge that those biases are there, and we have to challenge ourselves to deal with them. We have to stop feeling as if we're being personally attacked if a view that we express or a belief that we have is challenged, and that's a really, really hard thing to do. And it's very hard for leaders, actually, because there are those leaders who want to have their views affirmed, and actually what you have to do is to let go and let others come in. I mean, there are lots of things that we're all doing in terms of mentoring schemes and so on that make a difference. But let me stop by saying what I think we really, really need at the leadership level. We need a leadership that is absolutely inclusive, that creates the spaces and the opportunities that enable these discussions to happen in a secure environment. We need to have our values as institutions, but also our values as individuals up front and center It's really about walking the talk and about being challenged. And it's an incredibly hard thing to do. We have completely revamped how we deal with issues to do with sexual harassment, for example, at SOAS. And what it has led to have been some really uncomfortable moments for us as management, in the way that then we're challenged on some of the decisions that we take. Not because, in my view, the decisions that we were taking were wrong, but because sometimes people get locked into positions which don't sufficiently take on board the nuances and the complexity. And it's going to become harder and harder, not just in relation to issues to do with harassment, but in relation to issues to do with other things as well. So you have to continue to have the debate and the discussion. We actually have to make sure that we hear the diverse perspectives that people bring around the table. There can be a pretense of listening, which is very different to hearing what you're being told, and then what you do about it. We have to make sure we challenge ourselves and offer different opportunities to our staff. We crucially, I think, have to recognise that people are not automatons. There's a huge emotional element to all of this, which is not manageable. How we feel about something cannot be addressed by just having a policy paper or a way of dealing with something which is about ticking a box. It just doesn't work. It is much, much more complicated than that, and it's going to be messy. And we just have to accept that in wanting to have organisations which I think fly because of the commitment to diversity and making that diversity a reality and ensuring excellence, that along the way it's going to be a pretty bumpy ride. It's one of the reasons that, as it were, I like being in leadership roles, because you get challenged all the time. But it's not an easy road to be on. But what you get at the end of it, if you get it right, working with a fabulous team, is unbelievable. So I hope that's what all of you will go away and do. Thanks very much.